we have David, we have Tom, and we have Nawazit. Those are the ones that I see that are currently on the call.
And Dwight's on.
Okay, thank you.
Juliana here. I'm here. Juliana.
And I think he went on and he started recording now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Juliana. Let me repeat that. One of the things that came out of our meeting yesterday is that we need to look at the time frame implementation of the projects that we want to put forward. And I know Councilor Gamble is very much aware of this. The community policing piece, that will be controlled by the council. The funding will come from the council and out of the council's budget. The request to the Metro Council will be approved by funding that will be put into that budget, the 2021 budget, which would be requested in the May, June of 2021. July 21, we could begin training contingent upon council approval of the funding. In fall of 2021, we could begin implementation of community policing program in all the precincts. Now that would give us time in that space to determine the hot spots in the zip codes, in the precinct areas that we feel we want to focus on. So that gives us a timeline for community policing because that is dependent upon the council appropriating the funds. We're going to ignore the things that are looming out there that might control that we don't want to talk about. Let's just assume the council is going to appropriate those funds.
Could I ask a question? We don't want to have community policing all over Metro.
Yes, we do. That's the goal.
Okay.
In each of the precincts, but we want to start with a hot spot in a precinct. Mm-hmm. The area in each of the precincts that is in most need of that service.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
And that's what happened in West Precinct. It was the 40th and Clifton area that they started in, and I believe now it's in 3 or 4 different areas in West Precinct. So we settle on a hot spot, and the precinct commander would be able to tell us which hot spot would be most needed in each of those precincts.
Great.
As far as the CIT program, that the applications for grant funding under the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration are open beginning the 1st of January. The grants are awarded September 30th. So we would request the money in January with the funding being awarded in September. Now, the second component of that is we have to request training from the National CIT office, which the training basically comes out of the Memphis CIT group. Right now, they're not doing any in-person training because of COVID. So it would be a matter of us going ahead and requesting the training, getting in line, and as soon as they do in-person training, being in line to begin that process. And hopefully the funding would come along at the same time. If not, we would just wait until we got the funding and be the first of the line. But both of those would come in about the September timeframe. But both of those are obviously dependent upon the funding. But Ellen Abbott felt very positive about us obtaining the funding for CIT. So that is not dependent upon the council or upon Metro government providing funding. And Bob, I see you joined us. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions about the timing on those?
Yes, it's Councilwoman Gamble speaking. Do we have an idea of how much funding is needed to implement these programs? Is that a part of our recommendation, or is that something that we have to provide?
As far as CIT, the grant we would be requesting is a $5 million grant, which is $1 million each year for 5 years.
Okay.
As far as community policing, I have no idea. Ms. Roberson, do you have any idea?
No, and I don't know whether or not it will be a matter of reconfiguring or reassigning police officers that are already part of the force to this particular task, or whether or not they'll have to have more officers. So it could be that we could start it the same way. I don't know if West had to hire new police officers or just to reassign the police officers that already exist. So if we do that, it could be fairly revenue neutral if you just reassign police officers that are already there, but I'm not certain the best way for them to do that.
It's Jennifer Gamble again. I believe that the West Precinct repurposed officers that they already had. I'm not sure if, like you said, if every precinct will be able to do that. But in addition to that, in my conversations with Commander and Sergeant Bacanza, they suggested that there is also funding needed that they've been able to get from the other nonprofit, the Fraternal Order of Police and other groups, to provide assistance to neighborhoods. That is very valuable in that effort to administer community policing. For example, if they found that a resident is the family is sleeping on the floor, they've been able to buy beds to help that family and things like that. So there may be some discretionary funding that may be needed to help implement that community policing.
Councilman, I was just looking at the note. It's $300 per trainee for community policing. As many as MNPD assigns, it's a 30-hour training. So it's $300 per trainee for the 30-hour training. Now that's obviously not to work the shift, that's just for the training.
But thank you, that is helpful to include.
It seems to me like the question, which is a really good question, is really related to what piece of this is the philosophy that we want incorporated into all of the police force versus what piece of this is the actual community policing that is being done by that small group in those hot zones. So I think if I understood this correctly, we wanted a both and. We wanted, like what Bill Haas presented, the overall philosophy of community policing to take over the entire police force, for that to be the philosophy that drives it, but specific units within specific areas to be community policing for those hot zones, coming from current policing or current other areas that are specializing in other things to be retrained and focused, so that way it's neutral financially, so it's not a greater financial burden. That's what I remember, but maybe I am misremembering.
Well, why don't we look at our recommendations, but I wanted to make sure we had the date, understood the time limitations as we looked at our recommendations. So as we continued to fine tune them and see if we wanted to add anything to them, we knew what our time constraints were. Sharon, do you want to take the recommendations and work on that piece?
Yes, and I'll in a minute I'm going to turn this over to Dia, because yesterday Judge Blackburn and I spent a half a day with the other committees. As you know, we're structured such that we have 3 subcommittees under the Policing Commission, and one deals with police policies and procedures. One deals with the hiring issues involving who we bring into the police force. And of course, we're the community subcommittee. So what we did was we looked at each of the issues that each subcommittee was supposed to analyze and review and make recommendations. And we started seeing some overlap. We started seeing some synergies. We started to see how things would work together. So as a group, we put together a structure that we're going to use, and we actually fit our recommendations into the structure that the whole commission leadership came up with. The mayor actually joined us for part of the meeting, and he had specifics that he really wanted certain groups to address. I think he liked the direction that we were going and appreciated our work very much and made that very clear. the deputy mayor was there, and she talked to us. I guess that's her title, isn't it? She's deputy mayor. Yeah, she was there, and she, would listen very much to where we were going. And we also really did a relatively deeper dive into some of the data that we're going to use to support our recommendations. So I don't know, Dia, did you send out this? Yeah, you sent this out to the whole group or just to the leadership? Oh, this is, I don't want you to, go ahead.
Yes. Good evening. And yes, I did send it out to the full group so that we have the draft working framework that we walked out with.
All right. So we ended up with how many buckets? With 4 buckets of information that are really a framework. And we're going to fit our recommendations under one of these. And I'm going to ask Dia to walk us through the working draft report framework, because we really want this to be comprehensive, but we also want this to, not duplicate other people's work. I will say this is that we're on a very tight time frame, so people really need to understand we're trying to get something that can be used by the selection committee. They will have something to look at. 2 things I want us to keep in mind. One thing is we're going to have a series of questions that we want the selection committee to ask the candidates. 2, we need to look at some things that are quick wins. I think the mayor wants to come out, hit the ground running. This is a quick win, but some things may take a longer period of time. And that's why the timeline that the judge discussed earlier is so important, because some of these things will take some time because they'll have to be on a new budget cycle. But some of these things we may be able to hit a little faster. So I'm going to ask Dia to take over.
All righty. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to ask my friend in IT services, Mr. Dontry Buchanan, if he could pass me the ball so that I can pull up the framework that we walked out with yesterday. Okay, so let me see if I can get this up and going. Okay. Hang on a second here, folks.
I'm so glad you're doing that, not me.
It's not coming up yet. Hold on. I apologize. Just give me a second here.
Well, welcome, Dia, to my last 9 weeks of virtual teaching. I've learned it's really good to have background music while you're trying to do all this.
Right. And so I was hoping I could pull it up directly from the email I sent to you all today. And it didn't seem to want to identify that email. So I'm just
going to come up, but then it went away. It came up, but everything came up, but not that particular email.
Okay, let's see. I think I got it now. All right. We're going to do this.
I could sing A Wonderful World as background if you want.
Oh,
it's just in time. Just in time.
Bob.
Mr. Fisher, Dr. Fisher, I'd imagine you're a man of many talents, so we would welcome your singing at any point. So here's what we did. So as Sharon was saying, we had a half-day facilitation, as you all know, and we thank you enormously for your time and work in the commission. Obviously, to work on some of our greatest challenges in society, we would want to do it all in person, but for the pandemic. So we had a half-day meeting yesterday, and through that work, what that really allowed us to do was to identifying overlapping themes. As you know, your committee, as well as the other 2 committees, submitted their draft recommendations on October 9th, last Friday. And we reviewed those and we identified sort of 4 very specific areas for participants yesterday to work on during the half-day session. By working on that, we were able to build into an overarching goal, a working overarching goal for the commission, and identify 4 buckets, as Sharon was saying, and these buckets are thematic buckets. So first and foremost, the overarching goal that came out of the work yesterday was our goal is to build community trust and confidence in MNPD overall and within each neighborhood with MNPD. I think that this committee and the other committees have really hit upon the uneven level of trust that exists with MNPD among communities and among populations. Okay, so the first bucket is really around the workforce. It's MNPD reflects, we would want the specific results that we want to achieve that will put us on track to achieving this goal are the first one being MNPD reflects the diversity of our community at all levels in all departments of the force. Under each of these goals, what we can see is a problem statement. So coming out of the planning session, one of the big problems that was highlighted during the planning session, and there are others from the workforce committee, but the one in particular was recruitment and promotion behaviors currently work against this goal. Beneath that, we will introduce recommendations from the workforce committee on that item. The next goal or objective is racial disparities in all types of use of force are eliminated and reported publicly to address the perception of widespread inequitable use of force. So the problem that this objective seeks to address is that some use of force show disparities in use, and the community believes use of force is widely inequitable. So the data show that and lived experience show that. So we would take recommendations coming out of the policies committee to address some of this. The third item is really falls squarely within this committee's purview. And the result that we would want to see, the future condition that we would want to see is that the presence of police is viewed as an increase in safety and conflict resolution in all neighborhoods. In the planning session yesterday, it became very clear that one of the real problems is that too many communities are reluctant to call police and view their presence as an increase in the risk of conflict. So this is something that you all have discussed at length, and I'll come back to this one, but I'm just going to read the fourth item. And every committee has talked about culture within MNPD. So the fourth result that we seek to have is culture and behaviors of MNPD reflect an equitable distribution of discretion and skills to fairly engage across all encounters. So what was the problem that was really corresponds to this result we want is that the current training and promotion policies and procedures fail to equip officers with the skills to connect with diverse populations and reflects a default position of police as warrior, not as guardian. We're going to be working with some of this, to wordsmith it and really ensure that it fully reflects the work of all the committees. But this is the working draft. So if we go back to number 3, which is where this committee really sits, is, I think it's a truism, and I think you all will have to tell us how you feel about this problem statement, this initial problem statement about how communities are reluctant to call police and view their presence as an increase in the risk of conflict, such that we would want a result or a future condition that is the presence of police is ultimately viewed as an increase in safety and conflict resolution in all neighborhoods. So I'm going to stop now. I know Mr. Dwight Lewis is on the call. He's our commission co-chair, and certainly I would invite Mr. Lewis to remarks or share insights as we go along as well.
I think the only thing I might add is that we're not saying, this commission will not say, we don't want to say that our police department is doing a terrible job. They're doing some good things, but we want to improve upon some things, that these buckets that are listed. And that's the main goal. And to let everybody in Davidson County know that that's what we want. And we want the new police chief or the candidates to see this when they come in to be interviewed. Or I think that's the main goal. But we're not saying that our police department is awful, but we would love to see some improvements. And we want everybody to feel that our police department is there to protect everybody. And we're going to we'll get into with the use of force and some other issues, some other remedies, or not use of force as a remedy, but some other concerns that we have.
Good deal. Yes, I do think the Nashville model is a police department that works for everyone. Are there comments or questions from committee members about this working draft framework?
Yes, it's Jennifer Gamble speaking, and I'd like to echo the sentiment by Mr. Lewis about how we want to project the idea that we're working to improve the service of our Metro Police Force. I didn't see in the framework anything, and I may have missed it, anything about where we talked about collective efficacy, working with all of the stakeholders, the MMPD working with all of the stakeholders in the community to improve or reduce crime and mitigate the causes of crime. Is that anywhere in this framework?
So I think right. So I think that's a great question. And so I do think collective efficacy does fall under here a bit. We may need to, adjust this result here. But what we're asking committees to do right now, because this is a working draft, is to be sure that all of their recommendations are complete. If there are any gaps in their recommendations, to fill those gaps, so that we can have a full list of the recommendations and slot them in generally into these buckets, and then see what we need to do in terms of really speak to the issues. We might need another bucket, for example. The other place that part of collective efficacy is talking about culture within the police. So number 4 also talks about that, which is, and I think what I really like about number 4 right now is the problem statement, the first portion of the problem statement, which is the current training and promotion policies and procedures fail to equip officers with the skills to connect with diverse populations. I think collective advocacy is about understanding the role of a police officer in community problem solving. And so what skills do they need to pivot their position into really problem solving?
And just to follow up on that, and also the police department in working with, as I said, the stakeholders, whether it's community groups, churches, schools in that community to help solve those problems, so that it's not just the police trying to solve those problems, but they are maximizing support from community members to help solve those problems as well.
Absolutely. I think your draft recommendations speak to that very clearly. So we'll want to be sure that these overarching results are really truly reflect a lot of that and are in alignment with that.
Hey, Dia.
Yes.
Tom Turner. On 4, I was just thinking about what Dwight said, and I missed Dwight over the last few years too. But just would it make sense if we said the current training and promotion policies and procedures should equip officers with skills to connect with their diverse populations and reflect a default position of guardian, not as warrior? To me, we're almost implying that it's completely broken. I don't know if it fails to equip. I think we can certainly better equip people, and that's our goal. Is we're not broken, we're just imperfect. We want to improve.
I think that's an important point here. So that's a problem statement. So it does need to point out what are we trying to fix? Why do we want this future condition, right? So one way to really address this, because we've seen that there is the West Precinct model, so some training is working, right? So we are getting skills and behaviors that are desirable. We could rephrase it to the extent of the current training and promotion policies and procedures equip officers, unevenly, or don't fully equip the whole force in this purview. So I think there are a couple of ways to lessen that, and I hear what you're saying. I am taking notes, by the way, on comments.
It's just a thought.
Yes, this is Larry, and I'm looking at, which is what you said is dealing with the community, right? Or is 3 and 4 dealing with the community, or what we are here for? Because I know at first our attention was directed to 3, and then someone just brought up number 4 is related to what we are here to do in this committee. And as I look at it, we talking about what they did in the West Precinct out West Nashville. However, why get police officers to do the work of social workers? Or why get police officers to do the work of community organizations? So if they see that a family need beds, it's community organizations that's out here that's already doing that type of work. So it's like we are, sending resources to police officers when they can just focus on the job, and we can delegate those other things to these other social workers or community organizations.
Yeah, Larry's absolutely right. One of the recommendations about vulnerable populations that we'll get into and fit under our main theme does say that we need to identify things that have been traditionally part of police work and see other groups that may be able to do that work better. That's something that we're looking at, because that's the whole basis behind CIT. Traditionally, police have had to handle all of this, and we're looking at other organizations that can be used to better serve that purpose. So that is one of the things that's definitely part of our recommendation.
And Larry, my point would be, yes, but I think the police just need to be aware of all those resources. That's part of it. That should be what we're trying to do, is give them new tools, new opportunities to hand these things off quickly to the people who can help with either homelessness or mental health or domestic violence or all those issues we've talked about. So I don't think we really disagree. I don't think there's any disagreement. We just need to say it right.
I know we speaking on CIT, organization in Memphis, but we can focus on organizations here in Nashville, that's doing things that's admirable in communities that's in dire need, that's happening right now, as opposed to we talking about CIT, something that's going on in Memphis. That's a smack in the face to organizations that's down here doing the work here in Nashville.
Well, I think what we're saying though is we can start. The right leadership could start this tomorrow and start building it, but also we need a long-term way to sustain it through the funding and that model. That's a good model to keep it going. And so again, I think it's not either or. I think it's all of it.
And they come in and train across the state. That's the point of using them. They train Knoxville. They've trained Jackson. They just have the tools to train us. They're not going to stay here. They're just going to come in and show us how to do it, best practices, and they're going to leave. We're going to do it.
I understand. And part of 3, what we talking about, too many communities are reluctant to call the police, and building a trust within these communities, you know, or as y'all say that, you know, we need to improve things for the police department. However, the police department got to show improvement, and it's really not showing improvement when you're hiring police officers who are, you know, who've killed community members. And it's an officer that's on the force, Nathan Glass, who's just been hired and killed. He was a security guard and he killed a community member. So it's like if the police department is trying to show the community that they want their trust, we can't be hiring, you know, police officers with sketchy passes or whatever the case may be that, you know, make the community feel, you know, some type of way. You know, if we're gonna start over, and you can look up the name Nathan Glass and you all can do your research on him, but it's like if we're gonna set off a new course, let's do it right.
So
Absolutely. And I tell you one thing that we did yesterday, Larry, in our half-day session, there is a whole committee that's looking at the policies and procedures. And that's one thing the mayor charged them with, to really drill down and see what the policies and procedures for hiring a police officer. We talked about the civil service exam, looking whether or not that's neutral. We looked at those things. That wasn't the charge of this committee, but that was the charge of another one. And I am not an expert on how they go about hiring police officers, but there is another group of another committee that spent a great deal of time looking into that. I don't know this particular circumstance, but it did appear from what they were saying is quite a process. And so I really, you know, I think we're going to have to leave that to the other group to come up with the best policies and procedures for the hiring practices.
I wonder if under recommendation 3, to kind of get at some of the things you just said, Sharon and Larry. So recommendation 3 says the problem, too many communities are reluctant to call police and view their presence as an increase in the risk of conflict. I wonder if, as the recommendation, we can use community go-betweens in that relationship. So when Sergeant Pacanza came, he talked about the role of the West Nashville Dream Center as this community go-between where there's already community trust. So I wonder if in inserting the recommendation, it has something to do with each precinct building genuine relationship with communities that already have trust in that community. And right here in this committee, you're talking about Gideon's Army in North Nashville. You'd be talking about Conexion with Juliana over there on Nolensville. And you're talking about the Salahadin Center. So I wonder if a recommendation is the need for the precincts to go through the community organizations that are already existing. That way, hopefully, we can get at this. That's what Sergeant Pacanza said with West Nashville.
Well, if we go back to the actual recommendation sheet that we sent out to everyone that we read. If you look at that, everything we're discussing right now is contained in there. What we're looking at now is taking what we've already agreed to as something that we want to put in the recommendation and fitting this underneath the number 3, which is the presence of police is viewed as an increase in safety and conflict resolution in all neighborhoods. Well, it says in all neighborhoods, that's actually what it says. One thing I do want us to look at is the actual problem. It says too many communities are reluctant to call police and view their presence as an increase in risk of conflict. I didn't know whether it'd be more appropriate to say many vulnerable communities are reluctant to call police and view their presence as an increase in the risk of conflict. And this goes along with what Dwight was saying and others, that we don't want to, Nashville has a lot we need to improve on, but we don't need to march backwards and say they've been doing nothing in Nashville. in fact, one of the things that the mayor brought out, which is, a good and a bad, he wants us to be the best that we can be, but he acknowledges that we're better than some. Now, we are not perfect, but we're better than some, but that really makes it really good because we can become excellent. We can move from, let's say number 7 to number 1 and be the best police force in the country. We can be the model. And we're models in some things. Our family safety center is a model for the nation. So this is where we want to go. That's our aspirational goal. So I think there's really many of the vulnerable communities, the New America communities, the African American communities, the trans community. There are a lot of vulnerable communities, and they are reluctant to call police because they think this is going to create more of a problem. And I think that that's really more of what we're addressing, I think, in our recommendations. Now, we can discuss that, but that's just the way I see it. In the statement, I see why it was worded like this, but I don't think it takes into account. And one of the committee members actually brought this up in the discussion, that from his perspective, now it's a perspective I disagree with, but his perspective was that this is not as much of a problem as we think it is. And I'm that's my words, not his words. But I think that in order for us to give meaningful recommendations, we're going to have to make these recommendations account for the fact that there is a difference of opinion between communities. And really what we're focusing on is those communities that do have a distrust, because that is the gap we need to fill from the communities that have trust, and really work on those communities that we have to build the trust.
Sharon, I agree with your recommendation to change it from 2 to many communities.
And also, I agree with your recommendation to add vulnerable communities.
Okay, so Dia, you want to put up the sheet that starts with our recommendation? That you highlighted?
Yep. Hold on. Okay. Here are the committee's recommendations that were submitted to you last Friday. And there's some highlights in there. But you don't need to regard those right now. Sharon, did you just want to walk through to remind everyone sort of how the order of them and?
Yeah, we can. I mean, really, we can look at the highlights. What we wanted to start off is we recognize as a committee that there were these communities that had I call it a healthy distrust. There's a rational distrust for the police. It's not something that's in their minds. There have been police behaviors that are not favorable to having the trust of various communities. And we've heard from those speakers. We've talked to them. They've said that, we're treated differently. We don't have this. We don't feel comfortable. So that's something I think we can all acknowledge. Then we go into this concept of community policing. Now, we do have the West Precinct and their relationship with the Dream Center as a model, but our recommendation also recognizes that there are other models in the community, so that when we put our recommendation into this framework, we want to make sure everyone understands that there are other models, and we're going to have to work toward the model that's best for Nashville. And so that's one thing that we need to make sure we understand, that we aren't really just saying this one's perfect with this relationship. We're saying this is one that we will draw from in developing this community policing model. And really it's going to take between now and the time frame for the next Metro Council budget to be passed for some work to be done around this area. There could be another police chief that comes on board that says, this is the way I think this should work. They're going to have to do a little bit of the work with this concept of community policing. Now, to me, the concept of community policing and community advocacy are all fit together. The Dream Center is really that sitting there in that West Precinct as a community agency that's saying we're bringing people together, we're talking to people in the community, this is what the community thinks policing should look like. So they're sort of working together. And that concept being integrated, I think, could be an early win for the police force. I don't think that's going to really take us. hiring a whole bunch of police officers. It takes really understanding it, making that a goal as far as your culture. All police officers are going to have to understand, agree with that. They're going to have to learn to listen to the community and not see themselves as we run you, as we work with you. And so that concept has to be part of that recommendation on community policing. And when they talk about early wins, I really think adopting that strategy and that concept, even PR within the department, there's external and internal PR. Both ways you can really push that concept out. And I think it would do a lot if people really understand that the police force is going to, turn over a new leaf like that.
Having a new chief is going to make a big difference. And when that new chief comes out with something like this, the whole, as we talked about yesterday, Sharon and Dia, the attitude shift, just the whole turning to the left slightly or turning to the right slightly and just coming out with a new zest is going to make a huge difference in the attitude of everyone in the department, I hope.
Yeah, and I think so. And I think that all that really, not only Nashville, but the country's been through, people are really looking for, even if someone is, let's say, guilty of doing something the wrong way, we're going to draw a line in the sand and move forward. And moving forward, this is the way it's going to be for us. So I think that that's very important. We go into a recommendation on funding. And the reason for that is we have to fund some of these nonprofits. That's why it's very important what the judge is putting forward about the funding source that could be available for CIT and for that training. Because, as we always say, no money, no mission. And anyone that works in the nonprofit area understands this. It's just a reality. If you don't have enough money, your mission kind of falters. So we do recognize in order for us to work with these nonprofits and help them, et cetera, we're going to have to do some of this funding. We have a recommendation about expanding policies and procedures and programs dealing with vulnerable populations and methods of doing that. I think that the community and collective advocacy and community policing all can fit together. And that's really just all one recommendation, because you're targeting working with these vulnerable populations, because that's where the gap in the trust factor works or is. We talk about specifically CIT. The reason, and specific, responding to what your concern was, Larry, it is not a slap in the face for other community organizations that are doing the work. This is just one that we have information that shows that this works. This is one that targets many of the vulnerable populations. And it's really just an example of one of them that we have pulled out and say, look, this is really something that we can have a quick win. Plus, we know of a funding source that supports this kind of training. And so that's the reason it is there. And also EMS. We did talk about use of force, but I think that others are really looking at that in their committees. So we need to make sure it's covered, but it won't specifically be covered here, other than we recognize that use of force or how force is misused often leads to that distrust in the community. And so what we are proposing in cultural competency, things lead into this. What we are proposing is to take these recommendations, make them fit into this framework, because it does cover all our recommendations, and squeezing some together. They're all separated in this document that Dia is showing us, but they really all fit together. And as our quick wins or our questions, et cetera, we can move forward with this process. But that is really in a very concise manner where we are in our process. I will say, if anyone does have any concerns about something that we haven't covered as far as our recommendations, this is really, I guess your relatively last shot at getting something that is just totally lacking or missing in what we're doing, and get that added to these documents.
So could you give me an example of when it look like?
A quick win would look like?
Yeah.
For instance, right now we have issue with how those who are suffering from mental illness, whether that's a juvenile, for instance, we did recognize that there's a real gap in how juveniles or mental health crisis are treated in our community. That isn't easy to handle in Nashville. Even what we have now, the resources with CIT and with some of the other mental health professionals, there's a gap there. So what we're looking at is maybe having expanded training or training on how to work with juveniles who are having a mental health crisis. That would be a huge quick win, because if not, then like Sheila Calloway, she's dealing with kids that have a mental health issue in juvenile court. And this gets our young kids out of that criminal justice system. That would be a quick win for me.
Well, and if you don't get them out of the juvenile justice system, then they continue down that road and they end up in front of me with 15 or 20 charges. And it's hard to get them out of the system at that point, as you well know, Larry.
Yes, of course. And what if just through our data, same way we're gonna target or we're gonna see where the hot spots at? What if those hot spots are in the same spots where concentrated poverty is at? Will we do something about the poverty because they may have a big influence on the crime, or are we just gonna send more police in there in those
Now,
areas?
I will say, I would be the first to acknowledge that the underpinning, the underlying problem, and why you do have a lot of crime in communities is because of impoverished circumstances. And I wish that through this process, we could solve all those ills. And that's why I work every day to help kids in these schools and give them the needs and give them the things that they need. With that said, what we're trying to do is one of the interfaces with this very impoverished community are police. And we have to make sure that the police are not negatively affecting what's already, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it, bad situation. We don't want the police to make something worse. We're asking the police to get in there and be something, be a positive influence so that we can use them to help break the cycle of poverty in the neighborhoods. We're not going to, over policing is something you don't need to do, but yet you have to make sure that the people that live in the community are safe. And that's a very difficult thing, but that's why we're making these recommendations. So organizations such as Gideon's Army can support the police in the community while you're also working to alleviate poverty in the community.
I'm done. That was my question.
Any other questions? We also need you all to think about any questions that you would like us to put forward for the candidates for chief of police to be asked in the interview process. So please send those to Dia. We need those questions. I sent some that have been forwarded to me to her today. So please, if you have a question or if someone has a question they've sent to you, please forward those to her so she can compile those and get those to the committee. Those candidates are going to be interviewed, if I'm not correct, in early November.
Yes, and that's the expectation.
Okay. Their backgrounds are being checked now. So the ones that are actually going to be called in to be interviewed are going to the interviews are going to begin in early November. So we need to get any questions that you think you might want to have them asked to her so they can be vetted and put through the other list of questions she's got and the other groups are putting forward now. So get those to her if you can, the end of this week, the first of next week, if possible.
And that interview process, of course, these should be general questions, right? Such as share your views on community policing, something like that. Am I correct? Or how would you transform the culture of the department to be more sensitive to community needs, or is that what we're thinking about? Yeah, what's your response?
Yeah, I think that's, we want, as much as we want a police chief who can implement the recommendations of the commission, we really want someone who understands how to reorient an organization. So we will see a timeline, and they will have to do the work to get it there. So it might not be within our timeline, but we need them to do the work to get it there. So yes, I do think those are the right kinds of questions to be asking.
I also think people can ask more specific questions. I mean, you could ask, we have, 70-something% officers in the police force are white, and what would be your solution to bring diversity about? So you can step outside, and any question that you want, every question that's put forth may not be asked, but I think it's certainly worth looking at, because that was something that came out yesterday. How are you going to turn this into the police force that we want? And if you look at the applications, I mean, it is what it is. The people who are applying, are hired at certain percentages. And so things like that, you're welcome to ask and get those to Dia and work from there as far as the questions. Because I always say it doesn't hurt to ask.
So we originally talked about having questions in by tomorrow, but if folks can get me their questions by Tuesday at noon, would that work for everyone?
Thank you, Dia, for the grace period.
Happy to do it.
And who decides what questions are going to be once the questions are turned in? Who decides what questions are going to be chosen?
I think that's Dia.
I just want to know. I just want to know the individual to look for.
Well, the questions are going to her, Larry.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of more of the bus driver in all of this, Larry. I hate to say it. I'm that kind of decision making is above my pay grade. But what's going to happen is that we really want the questions to align with your recommendations. And if this is the emerging framework we're working from, so if I go back here, let's see if I can pull it up. Here we go. We really want to align with that framework and make sure that we're highlighting very key items that reflect this committee's recommendations. So I think that's going to be important too. I think, off the top of my head, I think, a big question is, tell us, when you created effective, constructive, collaborative relationships with community organizations, and what were you able to solve with those relationships? I mean, I think those are the kinds of questions that are going to be really critical to an incoming chief is really what has been their experience and their skills, and how have they applied them successfully?
Appreciate you.
Dia, are you looking for us to add on number 3 at where you've identified the problem? Are you looking for us to insert recommendations that came from our bucket list earlier? Is that what you're looking for with this?
Yes, so that's a great question. And so when we look at your full recommendation sheet here, the draft recommendations that you all submitted on the 9th, is we want to pull out these items so that and summarize them a bit, and so that they would fall under here. So you would insert a recommendation. We want to define other problems as it corresponds to the future conditions we want. So that's what we would be doing is taking all of your recommendations, if they fit here, or maybe they fit under number 4, but we want to be sure that they're represented in the framework.
Is it okay if I propose a recommendation to go into that problem?
Well, I think what we want to do today is to be sure that all committee members have a chance to add any remaining gaps in these recommendations. So if you see it corresponding to this problem, that's fine. But I really want to be sure that committee members understand that, this is a perfect moment. We have, let's see, community policing, community advocacy, funding of community engagement, first response items, cultural competency. So of this list, what else is missing? And if it helps to speak to these problems, that's fine too. But what do you all feel is missing that should go into your recommendations? That would be great to have.
Sorry, I'm just trying to understand. So we're trying to take the document that we worked for a long time on and to kind of squeeze it into these areas. And so you're just looking to see right now if we're just missing something that really stands out to us when we made our recommendations, if it just doesn't fit. Is that accurate? I'm just trying to understand. I'm sorry.
Yeah, there are a couple of steps to the planning process. I think the most important step tonight is really focusing on what other recommendations would you like to have as part of your overall list. Is there something that is missing from this write-up that you all received on October 9th?
Okay, thank you for your clarification.
Any other questions? Dwight, do you have anything you would like to add? Dia, anything else?
So let's just talk a little bit about timing. There are 2 more meetings on the calendar of this committee and of all the other committees. We'll have 3 more meetings before we have to wrap up the writing of the recommendations. So we have asked chairs and the full committee, commission, to provide us any final recommendations or changes to their existing recommendations by Wednesday, November 4th. So there's still a little time. If you want to, now that we're looking at a framework, if you want to see if there are, if there are any other issues that you want to raise or recommendations that you feel are necessary under your charge as the communities committee.
Well, and I'm betting Sharon would love any assistance that anyone would like to give as she tries to fit this in that framework. Sharon, are you going to decline any assistance?
Never, never.
I thought not. Obviously, this document will fly around numerous times, but if anyone would like to work with Sharon as she takes this document and fits it into Dia's framework, please feel free to volunteer.
Definitely, always here to help. So whatever we need.
Thank you, Council Lady. Very much appreciated. Your writing on the prior thing was wonderful.
Sharon, I'll be
Thank
happy
you
to take
so
a stab
much.
at it too.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say thank you. And thank you for the work that you all are doing, which makes it easier for us to kind of add to what the framework you all started. So thank you.
And one thing I will say is that sometimes most of you know this who draft a lot of documents, you get close to a document. And when you're so close to it, you can't really see it. So I really appreciate, especially you, Councilwoman Gamble, you kind of got me going in a better direction. So anyone, please, this is at the point that you can sit down and read something, understand where we're going, and realizing that when you're looking, you read the word so much, sometimes the words start saying what you think they're supposed to say as opposed to what they're saying. So make sure that you get those comments to me.
And Eli, thank you for volunteering as well. We appreciate your assistance. And I totally agree with what Sharon says. As many times as I've written something and read it, sometimes I can't see the forest for the trees. So thank you. Well,
Me too.
if there's nothing else, thank you all. And Sharon, convene your group and let's have at it.
Okay, so I will get going. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wait. I can't go home this early. My wife will think I'm lying about the other time. Oh, well.
You promised you were going to sing Wonderful World. Why don't you go ahead and sing Wonderful World right now? I'm ready.
He's going to have to sing that 16 times between now and next week to survive next week.
I see trees of green and red roses. All right.
Good
Are we still recording, Eric? Are we still?
We are still recording, so that will be, it's being, that will be taken public. So, Dr. Fisher, this is your debut, but.
Dr. Fisher may need it next week. Good night, everyone. Thank you.